Then they came out with the ground trainer. And obviously the ground trainer is not going anywhere. The people aren't going to fly about in a field. They're not going to dip and turn. There's no degrees of freedom in this ground trainer. But what happens is you get a student pilot in there, and you teach them how to control the rudders and how to control the stick and what it's like to sit in a cockpit. What's your visual like around you from inside the cockpit? And the person practices playing with the controls when it isn't important whether those controls are crashing the airplane or causing it to shoot straight up in the air. It doesn't matter anymore. They get the feel of all of this without actually flying the plane. And many people can fly this ground simulator and say, that's enough for me. Too scary, claustrophobic, I can't coordinate my hands and my feet at the same time. For whatever reason, I'm stopping here. And you don't have to take them up in the air and get them so scared they throw up in your airplane and mess up your plane. And you learn that on the ground. And hopefully, the people that throw up in your plane is greatly minimized. And in today's environment, the number of people who sue you for emotional distress goes way down. That's the 1920s. Now let's jump up to 1930. In 1930, Edwin Link created a device which changed simulation forever. It was a huge step forward. His father owned an organ company, and he got down into the basement of this company, or out in the warehouse of this company, and he started using all the pneumatic controls to create a flight simulator. And he came out with this thing called the Pilot Maker, or the blue box. And this device could pitch, roll, and yaw, and turn around this gimbal. The pilot could sit inside, and he had working instruments in front of him. And he was given a mission like fly through these waypoints, point A to point B to point C, and drop your bombs on point D, for example. And he would climb in there with a map, and he would try to fly the right distance in each direction and achieve point A, B, and C. Now obviously he can't look out of the cockpit and see anything. There aren't any reference points for him to say, ah, point A is right next to the church, and when I get to the church I'm there. So it was very much a night flying experience. I mean, flying blind, flying by instruments. Now how do you know if this pilot's doing any good or not? Edwin Link's the genius. He created a little device called a mouse. And the mouse is this little mouse that rolls around on a desktop. And underneath of that mouse is another map of where this pilot's going. And it's instrumented so that as the mouse moves, that's where that airplane would really be going. And it essentially traces out his path on a map. And when he gets out of the aircraft, he can come over and look and say, oh my gosh, I'm terrible. I only flew half the distance I needed to in that direction, or I couldn't maintain a heading, or for whatever reason, I never would have made it to the target if this had been a night flying mission. So you learn, don't ever let that guy fly at night. He won't get there. He'll be the wrong way Feldman. He'll end up bombing the Allies. Now, as far as daytime flying and using reference points, that's another matter. So far, we're not equipped to train people in that sense. You're just going to have to get them out there and get them flying. We don't have tools in 1930 to teach them how to learn those lessons. But we're going to get after it pretty soon. In 1941, the British Telecommunications Research Establishment created what they called simply the tree simulator. And the tree simulator used an analog computer to stimulate the dials in front of you. And so you would fly again very much like the Link trainer. Well, they were doing these experiments, and a Navy commander happened to be over there, and he watched these experiments with this tree simulator. He was so impressed, he said, we have got to build something like this. Now in the picture here, the picture is horrible. I'd love to have a better picture. It looks very similar to the Curtiss Wright flyer in the picture next to it, in that it's a seat sitting on a computer with analog dials in front of you. That's essentially what the device looks like. The commander who was so impressed was Commander Luis de Flores, later an admiral, later the namesake of the NOC TSD building in Orlando, Florida. He came back and he wrote a report saying the Navy has got to get into this virtual simulation business. And as a result, they created the Special Devices Division, which later became the Naval Air Warfare Center Training Systems Division, which we have now, which is where a lot of the naval flight simulators and other forms of simulators are born. Now before they got into the flight simulator business, or early in their career, one of the devices that they built was the ViewGraph projector. They're in the training business. They had lots of students being trained in classroom settings. And the Navy invented the view graph projector that everybody sits and watches view graphs with in business meetings today. Thank you very much, Navy. It's not a very popular device. Well, where do you think we're going next? You got to think about it. I mean, Edwin Link was playing with the idea. We have lots of flight simulators where people sit down and they play with analog versions of their dials, or they do practice with their radio equipment. Everybody has got to have a motion platform. Everybody's thinking, I have got to be able to move. So when I push the controls, I want this device I'm sitting in to move. And they really wanted it to move more than Edwin Link's device moved. And so in 1958, they created the Comet 4 simulator. This was Red Diffusion's project. This was a commercial aircraft trainer. The pilots would get in and they would fly this, and they had hydraulic devices on it that caused it to pitch and roll around like a real aircraft would. So you could get the climb and you could get the descent and a little bit of the pitching back and forth. Now, you're not going to do barrel rolls in this thing, but you can at least get the sense of motion. Now, what's missing still? You're the crew, you're sitting in there, you're looking out the windows. The thing you keep seeing out the windows is the building you're sitting in. You're not immersed yet. You've got devices that are really clever, that are really useful, but when you look out the window, you say, well, there's the wall, and there's Harry sitting over at the control station. You want to say, there's the airport in front of me. There is France. And there's that church that I was going to use for my waypoint. That's what you want. We don't have computers to do that. This is 1958, and Edwin Link was 1930. There are no computing devices that can do anything like that yet. But they're coming. You already know that. We've got to be able to create some kind of representation of the world around us. And these topographic representations actually were first built in a computer to do one thing: to drive the milling heads that were going to carve out a physical map board, a 3D terrain map board. So we'd go over to the computer, load data in, and tell it to drive this milling head across this board and cut out the mountains and hills that we will then pick up and use for pilot training. But that pilot training would be used with the audience standing around it looking and tracing out ideas. It would be used like a 3D map on a table. Then the Defense Mapping Agency says, you know what? We really need digital data for the operations research community. We need a digital form for them to start using in their newfangled computer software programs. And so in the 60s, we start collecting digital elevation data around the world. And finally, in the 80s, the Topographic Engineering Center says, we don't need piecemeal, we need the whole world. We need to know what the terrain looks like in a digital form for the whole world. And we're going to control what? Cruise missiles. We're going to load that information into the head of a cruise missile so that it can fly independent to a target. Or we're going to use that information to direct firefinder radars so we know how to fire back at artillery pieces. That's where the digital terrain started emerging and becoming available. But before we got there, there's the kind of map board that we use to drive those milling heads. I've stepped back in time, back to the World War II era. This was constructed by hand. They used to have these things called landfall toolkits. And the landfall toolkit was a kit that came from NOC TSD, and you opened it up, and inside there were trees and mountains and buildings and devices for carving gullies into clay. And all of the equipment you would need to sit down in front of a big board and build a 3D map that stood up, kind of like a railroad map. And we used those in World War II to train our pilots on how to ingress to a target. So the pilots would walk up and say, okay, I'm going to drop bombs on this city. How do I get there? And they say, well, go to the big church and then turn left. And from the big church, you fly out until you see this big lake, and there you turn. And they would walk through the mission in 3D this way rather than just in 2D. Now, you might say, do we use those terrain boards today still? Yes, even today. I'll tell you a story that I heard from one of my students. This guy worked for Special Forces Command. And he said, what we do is we set these terrain boards of some place that we're going to assault as a small team on a table in a room. We turn the lights off. Then we walk in with night vision goggles. And we get down at the aspect that we would be moving across that terrain, and we look to see if the enemy can see us as we're ingressing to whatever building we're assaulting. They still use those map boards to train the soft guys on their movements and their visibility as they're attacking a target. Until very recently, many war games were still carried out on these map boards. The map boards have mostly been retired, but not completely. They're still used in some war colleges to train people today. The first step we took in visual simulation was using shadow graphs. We couldn't do 3D images. We couldn't do images of any kind. So what we did was create shadow graphs. And you know, that's where you project the horizon of the terrain or the horizon of a city. And we essentially projected that on the wall in front of the flight simulator. And so as he flew along, we would instruct him to fly between two mountains, and we would change out the shadow as he moved along. And that was as good as it got for a long time. After we did that, we said, this movie thing, this would be a great idea. Maybe we could teach air-to-air combat with a movie. And just like you saw the gunnery trainer earlier, you could make a movie in an air-to-air combat situation and then put a guy in the simulator and have him try to manipulate the controls to imitate the scene as it was shot from the attacking aircraft. And he could learn what it's like to try and follow that path. Now, I don't know about any of you, but that's how I learned to drive. In the driver's education class that I took in high school, they had devices exactly like that. There was a camera set up at the back of the room, and they projected a movie of driving down a city street. And somewhere in that movie, the guy in front of you was going to slam on his brakes, or somebody was going to run a red light, or a child's ball was going to bounce out in front of you. And your simulator was a little driving compartment with a steering wheel, a gas, and a brake, and you were expected to swerve, hit the gas, or hit the brake at the right instant. And all the controller's terminal did was measure the number of times you gave the right response and the number of times you gave the wrong response. And for a high school kid, I was sweating. You're driving, and you're like, there's going to be an accident, something. You really are gripping the wheels and intense. Maybe I was a little too into it. But it did stimulate you to go, this matters, this matters. Even though all that happened, you can spin that wheel all day long. Your vehicle still takes the same path. They're just measuring whether you spun that wheel or not.